So we'll go ahead and move on to our next presentation from Eric Wong at UCSD. He'll be presenting work on neural attractors and cognition. So Eric, take it away.
Thanks. So I'll be presenting a simple high-level model for the core computational architecture for learning and cognition in the human brain. There you go. Okay, so the model is guided by some behavioral considerations and also some biological considerations. So to start off, we note that human intelligence, at least modern human intelligence, is mostly learned. Collective human intelligence is driven by the accumulation through language, symbols, and diagrams of knowledge from all of our human peers. We now spend the first several decades of our life learning a distillation of this accumulated intelligence. And we also note that the learned associations from all these lessons remain explicit, that is reportable, explainable, and teachable. And we would suggest that these features suggest like an associative network as an underlying architecture for most of this type of intelligence. Associative in the sense that we directly connect some, object A to object B. But we also note that parts of human intelligence are implicit, so that is not explainable or teachable. So examples of explicit and implicit might be, explicit knowledge would be whales and dolphins are cetaceans. The Pythagorean theorem would be explicit. Implicit is things like, is Fred trustworthy? Which of these two chess positions is stronger? Implicit thought usually has explicit components in it, but the hallmark is that they're incompletely explainable. And we suggest that the presence of that type of thought suggests that there are both associative and also deep components to the underlying network. Deep in this case meaning specifically that there are elements or layers in the processing that are hidden to the owner of the brain. We also note that anything can be input or output to the network for our brains. So the example, like what animals have feathers and what are birds covered with, suggest two ways of asking the relationship between birds and feathers that are opposite in direction. So they reverse input and output. But more generally, you can think of virtually anything you could think of can be either the input or the output of a particular question, either the question or the answer. In contrast, lower animals are more or less one-directional processing systems that map sensory input to actions. And also in contrast, in our own brains and most brains, examples such as the visual cortex actually are hierarchical and are directional. Even though they're recurrent, they're directional in their processing, in this case, processing input from photoreceptors to objects. And that suggests that the underlying structure is relatively unstructured, unlike a hierarchical network. Okay, so some biological guidance. We'll note that Hebbian, sort of synapse-specific plasticity, and neuromodulation, which is sort of less synapse-specific, are sort of the two classes of learning mechanisms that are well documented. We'll also note that this is less universally accepted, but something like attractors or cell assemblies or engrams, various other labels, represent things. So some set of cells in the brain represent objects. We also note that empirically, there is associative learning mechanism can connect attractors. So it's an example is classical conditioning, so we've shown empirically that just juxtaposing two things in time causes them to get glued together. Okay, and I'll go into this biological part in a little bit more detail. First, noting that the spike timing dependent plasticity, which is the main version of Hebbian learning, directly converts evidence into predictions. So if we take the example of some primitive organism that has a sensor, this is a neuron that gets input from some heat sensor and then decides that you should move in that response. If that same organism has a light sensor and a neuron that receives input from that. If there's a synapse between the two that is subject to spike time independent plasticity, what that synapse does is it's on the lookout for asymmetries in the timing between the input to the light and the input to the heat sensors. So if light consistently precedes heat, then that synapse will convert that piece of evidence into a prediction by wiring this synapse and causing the light neuron to excite the heat neuron and therefore predict that heat will come before the heat actually does come and allow the animal to move ahead of time, making that a prediction. Let's see. Okay, okay. And we've recently noted that this same principle of basic STDP converting observations into converting evidence into predictions scales up to the attractor level. So this is in a paper that we just uploaded to bioRxiv just last week. It's listed at the bottom of the screen. And we note that STDP can both create attractors in an initially random network, and it can associate attractors using the same, like effectively the same sort of mechanism as this neuron to neuron association that works attractor to attractor as well. So don't have time to go into that in detail, but so we would suggest that STDP and STDP-based mechanisms are actually sufficient to support all of these features. Okay, so to actually put together a proposed architecture based on these observations, we start with a random collection of neurons, randomly connected, recurrent, and into that we claim that these mechanisms can embed attractors from the existing pool of neurons. So on the left, they're shown as collections of neurons in green, but just schematically for simplicity, we show them as attractors as pentagons on the right. So the left and right are the exact same thing, just depicted differently. And we note that attractors can be associated with each other, and that also these background neurons can be attached to either attractors or to each other. Okay, so then collecting that into a model for both explicit and implicit thought, starting with explicit thought. So if you have some, if Sally happens to know that that whales and dolphins are both cetaceans, then this set of attractors would be in Sally's brain with these associations. If Sally wants to convey that information to Bob, then she might use language to convert this particular attractor structure, linearize it into a set of words, and deliver that set of words to Bob. Bob would then parse that set of words, and the understanding of language would cause Bob to say, oh, whales are cetaceans, dolphins are cetaceans, cetaceans include whales, cetaceans include dolphins, and just juxtaposing the excitation of those attractors in time causes those to be glued together by STDP, and then and effectively Xeroxes this association from Sally to Bob. And so we suggest that in your first 20 or 30 years of life, you might repeat a similar process maybe 1 million times and pepper your brain with hundreds of thousands of these associations. And that actually just the simple operation of those associations is probably the bulk of what we actually do with our brains. But there are implicit functions as well. And we'll remember that this STDP mechanism is active at any synapse that follows that type. And again, it's looking for regularities, so for statistical regularities in the spiking patterns between pre and post-synaptic cells. And anytime it finds statistical regularities, will convert that into increased synaptic strength and convert that therefore into prediction. And that happens all over the network all the time. So if you look at how that might support explicit thought. So if you ask Bob, is Fred trustworthy? There may be some explicit components to the answer to that. So, so Bob might not know if Fred is directly trustworthy, but know that Fred knows Linda. Linda is trustworthy, so that might provide some evidence. That's explicit. But in addition, Fred might explicitly know Bob might explicitly know that Fred is tall. That also doesn't connect directly to trustworthiness, but in Bob's experience of all the people he's run into that are either trustworthy or not trustworthy, those interactions may build up an implicit bias for either for or against tall people. In addition, this synapse right here may have noticed that every time Bob runs into Fred, there's a car alarm going off in the background. And with or without Bob actually consciously realizing that fact. And that connection would feed into the network and may influence the level of excitation of the trustworthiness attractor as well. So by that mechanism, this whole web of associations that's learned by STDP driven mechanisms might support implicit thought and learning as well. So this is just a very much simple core theory for human cognition. It's obviously surrounded by many specialized systems that are not included in this diagram, but we'll just summarize by saying that our hypothesis is that the core computational architecture of the human brain is a hybrid of an associative network driven primarily by human teaching, in addition to observations from the environment, supporting explicit thought, and that is embedded in a Hebbian network that's driven by STDP-based conversion of evidence anywhere in the network into predictions, and that supports implicit thought. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Eric. Nice talk. Any questions you have, just enter them into the Q&A. So I'll start with a question. So for this sort of model, how can you incorporate sort of innate biases and association strength between different types of stimuli?
Right. So there's, obviously in lower animals, there's good demonstration that genes have a remarkable ability to actually pre-wire a bunch of stuff. So that's certainly not included. This model is more, the learning part after birth. But and I don't know how the genetic part is actually implemented, but clearly there are both very sophisticated mechanisms for imprinting of innate behaviors, and also for very early learning of some things. For example, like intuitive learning of words and grammatical structures and stuff like that that need to support this kind of model.
So it would also work with sort of a semi-structured model that's not completely random to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, right. Obviously, this is very, very much simplified. There's, like lots of cell types. There's a bunch of structure that's in the cortex. There's layers and there's a lot of structure that is there. So what we're trying to ask is it's somewhat surprising that there's not really a well-established, really core computational model. And so this is obviously, grossly simplified. But it's asking whether, the pieces that are well understood, like STDP, can be cobbled into something that can learn a broad range of, human-like learning activities.
So we have a couple questions in the Q&A. First one from Kirubel, great talk. How scalable is this model to more complex decision-making tasks? What other mechanisms could be added for greater performance?
Well, actually, to me, the most interesting question is what happens when you make this network big enough that you can actually put your million associations into it. So it's not actually obvious to me that this mechanism by itself is not sufficient.
Next question from LR. How does the separation between closely related concepts emerge? Do you need mutually exclusive subset of neurons to implement two attractors?
That's a great question. And bottom line is I don't know the answer to that. That was kind of the topic of a really nice general adversarial collaboration that was sponsored by this same organization that was talked about last week. Like you know, do you learn new things by you know, activating old attractors, modifying them, and then repackaging them, or do old attractors stay separate, and you just modify associations between them? I think that's a unresolved question. I think this architecture supports sort of either version of that, because it's like, you know, I've drawn these pictures with associated with attractors separate, but the attractors could just as well be overlapping as well. But yeah, it's a good question, but I think it's unresolved.
All right, thank you again, Eric. Nice talk. We'll move on to our next presentation from